Good evening. Tonight's shiur, as always, Liu Nishmat Avi Mori Ben Dov Ber Meir Ben Ruben Alevi Imi Marati Rachel Bada Rav Michael. And this week we have the privilege of concluding the second book of the Torah, Sefer Shmot, which concludes with the assembly of the Mishkan, the final assembly for use. And we're going to really focus on that chapter and what happens in the aftermath. So, let's go right to our sources and we'll get ready to go. Okay. All right. So I'm focusing on chapter 40, the final chapter of Sefer Shmot. And it begins, if we look at chapter 40, there's really two sections to it. The first section is the first 16 psukim, which I've sort of given you the first and last here on the screen. It tells us Hashem speaks to Moshe saying, the Mishkan is to be assembled and ready for use on a regular basis, beginning on the first day of Nisan. And this is the second year after they've left Egypt. So it's the year 2449 from creation. And on that day, Moshe is to do a final assembly of the Mishkan, and after that, it's supposed to remain assembled. The Parshanim say, by the way, that for the 7 days that precede that, the 7 days of Miluim, during which Aaron and his sons are being initiated into the Kahuna, every one of those 7 days, Moshe assembled the entire Mishkan in the morning and disassembled it every evening. A lot of work involved in that. If you think about all the lifting and assembling and putting up curtains, etc. If you've ever been involved in a portable shul that's renting space that's got to have its be taken down every week or every day or whatever, you get a little bit of an idea of what's involved in that. And then, by the way, the next 13 psukim are all of the details of assembling it. You have Moshe, Hashem tells Moshe, you have to put up the poles, you have to put up this, you have to put up the put the menorah here and the everything here and everything there, and this is what you got to do to you have to anoint the Kohanim. And it says very simply, Vayas Moshe, for verse 16, Moshe did call it Hashem Oto Keinosa. Everything that Hashem told him to do, that's what he did. Now, interestingly enough, I would have expected it to end there and nothing else. But the next half of the parak, from verse 17 to verse 33, now gives us the deal. It says, Vayas Moshe did everything that Hashem commanded him, and now it's going to go into all the details. So in verse 17, we begin another section where it says, that on the first day of the first day of the first month of the second year, Rosh Chodesh Nisan of year 2, as I said, 2049, the Mishkan is established, is assembled. Vayakam Moshe Mishkan. Moshe goes through the motions. By the way, the Parshanim say that it's impossible for Moshe to assemble this all by himself. He had a lot of divine help. He just got to go through the motions of making it look like it's being done naturally, but in reality, all of this is being done by Hashem because one person couldn't possibly move all of this stuff. But anyway, and then it goes through in verse 18 to 32, all of the steps that Hashem told Moshe in the first half. Says he did this, he did this, he did this, and each one of them ends with Kasher Tziva Hashem es Moshe, like Hashem commanded him. And then finally, it concludes with the following pasuk, verse 33. By Yaakov Adar, Moshe again finishes the enclosure, Saviv LaMishkan LaMizbeach, which surrounded the Mishkan, the actual sanctuary in which the Mizbach HaKetoret, the Aron, the menorah are located. And then he put the curtain at the entryway of the courtyard. And then it says in verse 33, it ends with Moshe concluded all of the work. Now immediately then in verse 34, the cloud covered Ohel Moed, i.e. the tent. Okay? Uchavod Hashem, and the glory of God, Malay and Hamishkan, filled the entire Mishkan. Therefore, Moshe is not able to enter into the tent of meeting, into the Ohel Moed, because the cloud was resting upon it. Uchevod Hashem malei hamishkan. And again, that same exact phrase, the glory of God filled the Mishkan. And then the last three psukim, which conclude Sefer Shemot, really seem to not really belong here. They really belong in Sefer Bamidbar, where it talks about their travels, because it tells us the following: when this Anan would rise from the Mishkan, it was a signal to Bnei Yisrael that it was time to travel, time to move on. Throughout all of their wanderings for the next 40 years. If the Anan did not rise, it stayed above the Mishkan. They would not travel until the day that it moved. This Anan of Hashem was covering the Mishkan every day. The and there was a fire that covered it at night. Kol Beit Yisrael, and the eyes of all Am Yisrael saw this. And all of their travels. And with that, we conclude Sefer Shemot. Now, I wanted to focus on this Anan and the Chvod Hashem. That's what we're going to be focusing on tonight. What does this cloud represent? What does the glory of Hashem? What do each of those mean? What does it mean, Chvod Hashem alei et hamishkan, that Hashem's glory filled the Mishkan? So let's go right to the parshat. We're going to see what they have to say about all of this. So we start. Before we do that, a couple of other things. Basically, just because here again it says, notice it says Moshe cannot enter Ol Moed as long as the Anan is and Kvod Hashem Molei et HaMishkan. Okay, in another place, by the way, this goes back to Parshat Truma. Moshe is told by Hashem, "V'no'adati l'chasham." Moshe is told to make the Aron with the kaporet with the kruvim, and Hashem says, "I will meet you there." V'dibarti l'chami ala kaporet. I will speak to you from above the kaporet. From between the two kruvim, asher al aron which are on top of the aron. All of the commandments that I'm going to give you after you've received whatever you received at Har Sinai at Matan Torah, everything else, all other communication between God and Moshe is going to happen from the Kodesh Kodashim, from the Aron, from literally between Shnei Kruvim is where the voice is going to emanate from. Okay, so that's one. Now in Vayikra, beginning of Sefer Vayikra, we're told that Hashem calls to Moshe, Vayikra Moshe, Vaydaber Hashem Elav, and Hashem will speak to him, Me Ohel Moed Lemor, from the Ohel Moed. So again, we have a pasuk where Hashem speaks to Moshe from the Ohel Moed. We have a pasuk where he speaks to him, Me Ala Kaporet, from upon the Kaporet, which is in Ohel Moed. And then finally in Bamidbar, at the end of the chapter where we read about all of the offerings that are brought by the Nesiim, it tells us the following: Uvevo Moshe el Ohel Moed. When Moshe would come to Ohel Moed, lidaber ito, to speak to Hashem, vayishma et hakol, he would hear the voice of Hashem midaber love speaking to him, me'al hakaporet, from the top of the kaporet, asher al aron oedun, which is on top of the aron, mibein shnei kruvim. And Vaydaber love, and oftentimes that's how Hashem would speak to him. So we have these a series of different psukim describing the communication between Hashem and Moshe and where it emanates from. So we're going to talk about those two issues, or what we're going to speak about. Rashi first mentions, again, our pasuk says that Moshe could not enter Ohel Moed because the glory of Hashem is in the Mishkan. But another pasuk says, which we just read, that when Moshe would come into Ohel Moed. So how can it say here that he can't go into Ohel Moed, and there it says he did go into Ohel Moed? So Rashi seems to say very simply, there's a third pasuk that will explain why sometimes Moshe is not allowed to go into Ohel Moed, sometimes he is. What is that? When the cloud is resting upon the Ohel Moed, Moshe is not allowed to enter. When it's not, he is allowed to enter. Emor me'ata, which seems to imply, Rashi says, when the Anan is upon the Mishkan, Moshe is not allowed to enter. That's a sign to Moshe. Hashem is here, he can't come in. When the Anan goes, that's a sign that Hashem wants him to speak to him. When the Anan disappears, goes away from the Mishkan. That's Rashi's interpretation. Rashbam says the following: Moshe is not allowed to enter into Ohel Moed. What does that mean? B'shat hakabato. As soon as Moshe has finished assembling the entire Mishkan, he can no longer enter it. Why? Pasuk tells us, Kishachan alav ha'anan miyad. Immediately upon the completion, the Mishkan is filled with the presence of Hashem. Laharot, what does this teach us? Chibato shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu al Yisrael. The great love that Hashem has from Yisrael, that immediately upon finishing the work, as soon as the work is assembled, Hashem immediately comes and enters his presence into the Mishkan. Okay, he doesn't wait a week, 2 weeks, 10 days, whatever, immediately. But after Hashem has shown this love by entering the Mishkan, the Anan would no longer fill the entire Mishkan. It would vishachan alahe aron. The Anan would shrink down to the size of the Aron and rest upon the Aron, not upon the entire Mishkan. That's what Rashbam wants to say. Ki dichsiv, as the pasuk says, "V'no'adti l'chashama v'dibarti ichami ala kaporet." I will meet you and I will speak to you from the kaporet v'bein shnei kruvim, not from the whole Mishkan, but only from that area between the kruvim on top of the Aron. The Oz, and at that time when Hashem wanted to speak to Moshe, from there, as another pasuk said that we quoted above, when Moshe came into Ohel Moed to speak with Hashem, he would hear the voice emanating from between the kruvim. Now Rashbam says we find the same exact phenomena when Shlomo builds the Beit HaMikdash. When Shlomo completes the construction and he's inaugurating the Beit HaMikdash, we have the same phenomena. What is that? The Kohanim could not enter the Beit HaMikdash to start the Avodah because of the Anan, because of the presence of God. The honor of the glory of Hashem filled the house of Hashem. That originally, when the house is first built, Hashem shows that the entire house is Kodesh by resting his presence Anan on the entire Kodesh, on the entire Beit HaMikdash. Aval, acharecha, afterwards, hayimitsamtzem shchinato al haron ben amadim. Hashem would mitzamtzem, he would shrink the Shechina to the little small area that was on top of the Aron between the Badim. Okay, this whole concept of mitzamtzem, very important concept in Kabbalah of Tzimtzum, that Hashem, even though we know Meloch al haaretz kivodo, that Hashem is everywhere, Hashem, nonetheless, in terms of his visible, tangible presence, is able to shrink it so that we have to find Hashem. We are able to almost disappear into nature, into everywhere where we have to come and look for Hashem. Now, in this case, he is contracting his presence into the area of the Aram. Period. That's what the parshanim want to say. Oh, and then by the way, Rashbam has a very interesting praise of his grandfather, he's Rashi. He says, whoever really wants to understand what HaKadosh Baruch Hu was all about, Al Yazus Minimuke Zekeni, Rabbeinu Shlomo, Al Yamush Miami, he should really just study Rashi's Perush very, very clearly, and you'll get, don't deviate from Rashi's Perush. Kirov halachot v'drashot shem krovim l'pshtei hamikraot, because all the halachot and his drashot, which are right close to the pshat of the psukim, and from extra letters or extra words or changes in language, yesh lamod kulam, all of the halachot can be taught. You really want to excel in Torah and grow in Torah, grab onto Rashi's words, Asher Perashti, that I've explained, which are in line with what Rashi says. Don't leave Rashi's pshat. I thought it's a very interesting comment that he adds here at the end of Sefer Shemot. The Rashbam basically says, you know, if you don't like my pshat, go to my grandfather's pshat. You'll find that okay, and you'll be able to grow in Torah. Not to worry. Okay. The Eben Ezra has a long arichut. We're not going to go into the whole thing, but we're going to go into the first section. Lo Yachol Moshe. Moshe, as I said, could not enter the Ohel Moed. Lo Yachol Moshe az karu Hashem sheikanes el ha'oel. even though Moshe was not able to enter because it says Shechina love Anan, Hashem ultimately calls him and he will enter the Ohel. And Moshe would speak to Hashem where? Ibn Ezra's parish is unlike Rashi's parish. Ibn Ezra says very clearly that Moshe was able, because of who Moshe was, he was able to go into the Kodesh Kodashim, a place where the Kohen Gadol is only allowed to go once a year when he has the Ketoret on Yom Kippur. Moshe was able to go in there all the time to speak to Hashem. Ki Moshe ben Bayiru. Moshe is, he's at home in Hashem's presence, in Hashem's house, whatever that means. So Moshe, unlike everybody else throughout history, Moshe is allowed access to the Kodesh Kodashim when he has to speak to Hashem. Ibn Ezra. What forces me to say that Moshe had access, was given access to the Kodesh Kodashim? Ki Moshe sama luchot ba'aron. Who put the luchot in the Aron if not Moshe when the Aron was built? V'sham hakaporet shesham hakruvim ala v'sham hakaporet shesham hakruvim ala Aron. He was also the one who put the kaporet in place. V'alehem tamid hakavod. And the kapor, the kruvim, the kavod of Hashem was always resting on the kruvim. Now Ibn Ezra goes a step further and he says the following. We know that in parshat Bamidbar, it tells us that Aaron and his sons had to cover up all of the furniture before the Levium were able to come in and carry it. And Ibn Ezra wants to say that it wasn't only Aaron's sons, it was Moshe helping Aaron and his sons. Okay? Because Aaron and his sons were not allowed to enter the Kodesh Kodashim. How were they able to take the parochet down? How could they approach the Aron to put the parochet on top of the Aron? Therefore, I'm forced to say, before they would move, Moshe would go through the parochet into the Kodesh Kodashim. Aaron of Anav Yoridu Hamasach Hanikra parochet. Aaron and his sons would take the parochet, basically would hand it to Moshe. That the covering of the Aron before it traveled was not done by Aaron and his sons, it was done by Moshe. Shelo Yiruhu Aaron of Anav. Aaron and his sons were not allowed to see the Aron any more than anybody else was, except Aaron when he came in on Yom Kippur, and therefore Moshe has to be the one who's there covering it up. Even though the cause is V'chisu Bo, that Aaron and his sons are the ones who cover it, Ki Hayos Rimoto, they were helping Moshe take the parochet down. However, that's his opinion. And he brings down a Yesh Omrim, another opinion. By the way, that the Kohanim would cover the Aron without looking at the Aron. They would do it basically either backwards, or they would do it while they weren't immediately in front of the Aron. They do it with their heads turned to our side, whatever. That's another opinion. But Ibn Ezra seems to imply that based on our Pesukim, that Moshe did go in to speak to Hashem in the Ohel Moed, not like most of the other Parshanim say that he stood outside the Ohel Moed. Okay, Ramban. Anan at Ohel Moed. The Anan covered Ohel Moed. Omar, the pasuk wants us to understand Ki ha'anan yechaser ha'ohel mikol tzad, that the Anan not only filled the Mishkan, it covered it from all sides. That when the Anan came down and rested on the Mishkan, you couldn't see the Mishkan. All you could see was this Anan. And the presence of Hashem filled the Mishkan. Why couldn't we see the Mishkan? Because the inside of the Mishkan was filled with the glory of Hashem. The kavod of Hashem was resting inside the Anan. In other words, the kavod of Hashem is the first layer. On top of that was the Anan, and all of that is within the Mishkan. Just like in Yishnem Har Sinai, just like it says in Har Sinai, El Ha'arafel, to this deep, this dark, cloud-like structure, Asher Sham Elokim, because that's where God was. The Amar, why does it say that? The Amar Ki Lo Yachol Moshe L'Bo Moed. Moshe could not enter into Omed Afilu El HaPetach. He couldn't even enter the doorway. Mipnei shahaya Anan mechase oto. The Anan covered the doorway. And Moshe, until Hashem calls, but says to come into the Anan, Moshe has no permission to enter into the cloud. The Ode, and similarly, and another reason, if the Mishkan is full of the glory of Hashem, how can there somebody enter? How can a human being enter if Hashem's presence is there? But he wants us to understand that the reason is below rishut. You're not allowed. What it means is that Moshe couldn't enter without specifically Hashem granting him permission. But what would happen is Yikra'oto, Hashem would call it, and he would enter into this Anan, this heavy cloud-like structure, just like Asher Har Sinai, just like happened at Har Sinai. What happened at Har Sinai? Hashem called Moshe from this inside this Anan to enter the Anan. The Amar, and there at Har Sinai, Imam at Har Sinai, it says Vayavo Moshe b'toch Anan. Moshe entered into this Anan. The Aldvar Pshat, but the Pshat seems to be Bavur Shenemar, because later on it says Vayidaber Hashem Elav Me Ohel Moed, that Hashem spoke to Moshe from Ohel Moed. Lo nichnas Moshe leMishkan. Moshe never enters the Mishkan when Hashem is speaking to him. Avol kara otomi Ohel Moed. Hashem would call him from Ohel Moed. The Aman and Moshe would stand Petach Ohel Moed at the gate, at the doorway of the tent. Hashem would speak to him. So Moshe never enters. Unlike Ibn Ezra says Moshe enters into the Kodesh Kodeshim, Raman says no. Moshe not only doesn't he enter the Kodesh Kodeshim, he doesn't even enter the Kodesh. He's standing outside in the Chatzer near the entryway to the Ohel Moed, and Hashem is speaking to him from there. And that's what the Sukkim are implying, that it says that Hashem's voice emanates from within, and Moshe can hear it while he's outside. Rabbeinu Amru, and he brings down the Kohanim following. Moshe was not allowed to enter Omed because the Anan was there. And the other pasuk seems to lie that he did come into Omed. And the Torah Kohanim wants to say that when Shechan Olav, the same Torah Kohanim that Rashi quoted, according to this medrash in Torah Kohanim, uvevo Moshe Elohel Moed, when Moshe would come into Ohel Moed, shiavo sham below kriyamidato, he would enter without being called. Or perhaps Mesha Amar Sham, because it says there, why? Vayishmana kol midaber elam mi'ala kaporet. If Moshe heard the voice emanating from above the kaporet, near Elahem, it appeared to them, Shoya Moshe Omed b'toch it seems that Moshe was standing right before the kaporet. If that's where the sound is emanating from, he must have been standing right where the sound was emanating from. However, while the presence of Hashem filled Mishkan, Moshe did not enter it. Therefore, they are forced to say that when Moshe enters, it's after the Anan has left. Kilomar, that the Anan is left, it doesn't cover the whole Ohel Moed anymore. The Eino Kavod Malay and Mishkan, and Hashem's presence does not fill the Mishkan. When did Hashem's presence cover the Mishkan? Lo hayarak ze'arak b'yom hashmini bredet shem hakavod. When Hashem's presence first rests on the Mishkan, it fills the whole Mishkan. After that, before he calls to Moshe, he leaves it and goes only into the Kodesh Kodeshim where the Aron is. The pasuk says that he called to Moshe and spoke to him Me'ohel Moed. Al datam, according to this midrash, Kodem Lakein Hoisa had to be before Hashem limited or contracted his presence. That's why the pasuk says twice about Hashem Alei and Hamishkan. Yermos el hakavod hashochein b'kirbo. That is to hint to the fact that Hashem's presence originally fills the whole Mishkan and ultimately fills only a smaller area thereof. Okay, that's Ramban. Adar Zakeni. Uchvod Hashem Alei and Hamishkan. This verse is written inverted. The presence of Hashem filled the Mishkan, rather than saying the Mishkan was filled with the presence of Hashem. Kamo Adar Zikanim wants to tell us this is just like it said Mishkan Malay Kvod Hashem. There are many psukim shatevot hafuchot that the verses are inverted, and this one is l'chavot shemaim nefku. This one is specifically, among others, is very much turned to give honor to Hashem, to list Hashem at the beginning of the pasuk rather than to put it passively. And we'll see why. She'im katav, if the pasuk had written, "Mishkan hayam alei kvod Hashem," that the Mishkan was full of Hashem's presence, mashma shekavod hayam hamishkan, that the Mishkan is more honorable than Hashem's presence. Can't have Torah would never said that. But Mishkan machziko, that the Mishkan was able to hold the entire presence of Hashem. By saying the presence of Hashem filled the entire Mishkan, mashmasha kavod gadol, that the presence of Hashem is much greater than the Mishkan. Mishkan kanus b'tocho, that the Mishkan is subsumed under the presence of Hashem, and that's why the pasuk inverts the order and spells it out this way, that clearly that the Mishkan can't fully contain Hashem. Yes, it has Hashem, but it can't fully contain Hashem. Okay, Shvarna. Shvarna very simply wants to understand the Psukim. Vayichas Anan, as we saw before, take him achar shekola Moshe hamlacha. Immediately after Moshe finished all of the assembly work, Hashem immediately wants his Shechina to be there. And this is whenever the actual building and the avoda is finished. Then what happened? Kisa Anan, the Anan covered it. Visharta Shechina, and the Shechina rested. Again, Hashem does not want Bnei Yisrael to be waiting with bated breath to say, "Hey, is Hashem going to rest His presence or not? Has Hashem really forgiven us for Chet Hegel?" Hashem immediately comes down to remind everybody that He has forgiven them for Chet Hegel and He will rest His Shechina on this building in their presence. Malayat HaMishkan. Nigala b'chol chelek mishkan. It was apparent. Hashem's presence was apparent throughout the entire Mishkan. However, v'lo chutza lo klal. Hashem's presence did not flow over, even though it clearly fills the whole world. The tangible awareness of Hashem's presence filled the Mishkan and nothing else. That was it. Yorachayim Kadosh. Moshe was not able to go. The Hagam, however, it seems why does the fact that the Anan is there keep Moshe from entering? Shema Kazav Parshat Mishpatim. We already saw in Parshat Mishpatim by Matan Torah by Avamot Shevet Toche Anan that Moshe entered into the Anan, into the midst of the Anan. Why here is he not enter when the Anan is there? Sham by Matan Torah Haya Achar Shekori Lav Hashem. After Hashem called him, V'natan Bo Koach. Hashem gave him the permission and the strength to enter. Then he entered. Oh Yomar, or perhaps Al Zeh Derech Lo Yachol Moshe. Moshe was not able to enter. Batam, and the Torah gives the reason. Kishachana Lave Anan, because the Anan was resting on the Mishkan. The Ein Mitziut Zeh Mitziut Amar Parshat Mishpatim. This Anan and this Kavod Hashem is not like what we had in Parshat Mishpatim by Har Sinai. Kikan, because here by the Mishkan, Vod Hashem Alayat HaMishkan. Hashem's presence filled the Mishkan. Masha'ein came. This is not the same as Anan Shabbat Har Sinai. The Anan at Har Sinai, Sham Nevar, because there was a vast difference between the Anan and the Kvod Hashem, because there it says Umarei Kvod Hashem, the tangible, visible awareness Am Yisrael had of Hashem's presence was Ke'esh Ochelet Bro Shahar. This was the Eish that was on top of the fire, top of the mountain. The Samachle, and there the Torah says, Vayavo Moshe b'toch Anan, Moshe entered the Anan at the bottom of the mountain, Vayal, and then he was able to climb up the mountain inside the Anan. Perush, Makom she'ein sham shochein kvod Hashem. See, Hashem's presence is only at the top of Har Sinai, not at the bottom. Therefore, Moshe is able to enter over there. Masha'ein kain b'masha lefanenu, which is different than what we read here about the Mishkan. She'kvod Hashem malei Mishkan, that Hashem's presence filled the Mishkan. Therefore, Moshe is not allowed to enter where Hashem's presence is tangibly there and physically tangibly there. Kleyakar. Okay, now Kleyakar wants to try to understand the difference between Kvod Hashem and Anan. Which is which? Is the Anan the tangible representation of the Kvod Hashem, or is this Kvod Hashem something else besides the Anan? So it says the following: Vechasen on it Ohel Moed, Kvod Hashem Alei et Hamishkan. Nira Mizeh. Kleakar says it appears from this concept, Shekavod Hashem Einenu Ha'anan, that the presence of Hashem and the Anan are two different things, two very different things. Ella, but Sha'esh, Ve'or, Dainu Kvod Hashem, the light and the fire, which we talked about at Har Sinai before, Ke'esh Ochelet B'rosh Hahar, that is Kvod Hashem. That was the tangible sign of Hashem's presence. But it was visible. Why were we able to even withstand and see that presence of Hashem? Because it was covered by a cloud cover. Mitoch Anan. Kizulat Anan, were it not for the Anan covering the presence of Hashem, how can we look at the presence of Hashem? It's such an awesome thing. How could we possibly look at it? We can't even look at the Shemesh, which is, a hair of Hashem's presence. We can't even look at that with our eyes. So, Kal v'chomer, bi'or zohar shchinato yisbarach. Obviously, we could not look at the glory, the radiance of the light of the radiance of HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shechina would be beyond human comprehension. Al Kain, therefore, Hayaor HaKadosh Hahu, this holy light, Tamid Nira B'toch Anan. It always had to be covered by an Anan. It could never be unmasked because we wouldn't be able to withstand it. It would be such a powerful experience. However, on the day that the Mishkan was established, they were separated. This radiance of Hashem entered the Mishkan. This now became the place of Hashem's holiest place, is now the Mishkan. The Anan, the cloud covering that covered over it, was not inside the Mishkan. The Anan is outside the Mishkan. Not like Ramban said that the Anan went to the edge of the Mishkan and just a little bit beyond. But the Anan was outside. The presence of Hashem, this radiant light, was inside the Mishkan. But the Anan was outside. And this is what it says at the end of Parshat Mishpatim. When it came to Har Sinai, which is what the Mishkan is trying to replicate. In other words, Mamad Har Sinai, that's the purpose of the Mishkan, is so that we have this traveling representation of Hashem's presence in Har Sinai, always surrounding us. Just like at Har Sinai, they were all camped around the mountain. That's why later we're going to see in Bamidbar they're all going to be camped around the Mishkan. Just like Hashem's presence rests on Har Sinai, it rests inside the Aron, and just like it's covered by an Anan, it's covered by an Anan. When Hashem's presence rested on Har Sinai, in order for it to be able to rest on Har Sinai, it has to have the Anan has to cover it, because if the Anan isn't covering it, it's impossible for us to see. By the fact that there's an Anan covering this glory of Hashem, that's how we can see it. Just like we can look at the sun when it's a cloudy day, we may be able to see the sun, or look through cloud, or look through sunglasses, or whatever shading we use. So too, in order to see the rain, we have to have this cloud covering it. Okay, in order to be able to see that, we had to have this presence of Hashem. As the pasuk says there, by Har Sinai it says the appearance of the Kvod Hashem Yisrael. All of Am Yisrael saw it. How could they see it? The only way they could see it was through this Anan covering it. So with this cloud, this Anan covering it, you can see Kvod Hashem. But here, in the presence of the Mishkan, the two are separated. It's not the Anan is covering, or the Kvod Hashem is inside the Anan. Moshe was a human being, cannot enter Olam Moed. Uchvod Hashem alei hamishkan. And the presence of Hashem is filling the Mishkan. So this Kvod Hashem is filling the Mishkan without there being an Anan. So it's impossible for human to go in there. You wouldn't be able to be able to bear it. If the Kavod Hashem was intermingled with the Anan like it was at Har Sinai, then Moshe theoretically could have entered. Moshe now, remember, so parshat Mishpatim, as it says in the end of parshat Mishpatim, Moshe could enter the Anan because the Anan covered the Kvod Hashem, so that he was able to see it. The Anan, since the Anan was covering Kvod Hashem, Moshe was able to enter into the Anan. Aval Achshav, here at the inauguration of the Mishkan, that these two are separated completely. The Anan was outside the Mishkan. For Hashem haya below Anan tocha oel moed, and the presence of Hashem, this radiant light without any Anan covering it, was inside Ohel Moed. Moshe was not able to enter Ohel Moed. Mashma, which seems to imply he was able to go up to the door, close to it, but he couldn't enter. Since the door he could go to because the Anan was resting there. Because we see that Moshe is able to go into the Anan. We saw that before at Har Sinai. And through this understanding of the difference between the Anan and the Shechina, the presence of Hashem, this Perush will answer lots of the questions that are raised by the Parshanim in terms of how do I understand what the difference between this Kavod Hashem and this Anan is. He says they're two separate things. The Kavod Hashem is this powerful, awesome, spiritual light that it's impossible for a human being to withstand unless it is covered by this Anan, this thick Anan. Then when there's Anan is there, you can get a glimpse of the presence of Hashem, the Anan. Okay. Shimon. Shimon has a very interesting comment. If we go back to the original pasuk, notice it. Remember, it said Kvod Hashem Olei Hamishkan. It says in pasuk Lamed Dalet, and then it says again in pasuk Lamed Hey, Kvod Hashem Olei Hamishkan. Tiv Od Pam pasuk Shalach Kvod Hashem Olei Hamishkan. Why do we have to have this twice? V'yesh l'faresh. This explain. Lama kativ kefel darazel. Why do we have to start understanding? Is there a double? Is this pasuk repeated? Kvod Hashem Olei Hamishkan. Yesh lomar. Perhaps this is the explanation. Dachi perusha. Ukvod Hashem Olei Hamishkan. The presence of Hashem filled the Mishkan. Therefore, Moshe was not able to enter. Afilu, and this is to teach us. Afilu Moshe. Hagadol b'kedusha, the greatest, who is the greatest in kedusha, b'tachlito, even in his function as leader of Yisrael, lo yachol lavo, he still can't enter. Mizeh mucha, this is to teach us oda pam, again, kama gadol kvod shalom moed, how great was this building that they built, and that Hashem shekvod Hashem olei hamishkan, that Hashem rested His presence on the Mishkan, that even Moshe is not allowed to go in there. Very different than what we saw before with some of the other Parshanim, especially Ibn Ezra says that Moshe did go in. Okay? So again, different levels of Kedusha, different levels of this. We're going to go to Al-Shich, who tries to explain this whole thing now. Okay. Amar. Seems to imply even though, okay, Moshe is able to, the fact that there's an Anan resting on the Mishkan is not enough to keep Moshe from being able to go in. Uledaber, and to speak to Hashem. Kedaber shnever parshat kitisa. There's one parshat kitisa. Givo Moshe ha'olala, when Moshe would enter the tent, Yered Amud Anan, V'yomat Petachol, the Amud Anan would come down and stand by the tent with Diber and Moshe. So the Anan is not why Moshe can't enter. Lazeh Omer, therefore the Torah has to say here, Ein Hanadon Doma. You can't compare here to what we saw in Ki Tisa, where the Anan came and stood by the tent. Not every place where we read about Hashem resting His Shechina is at the same level of resting of the Shechina. They're not all the same. Hisham over there in Kitisa b'midrash Shel Moshe, when we talked about Moshe having his own place to go outside the tent. This is before we got the Luchot Shniyot, and Moshe would go there, and Hashem would come down and be there. Hisham b'midrash Shel Moshe lo hayarak hashra mitzad ma. This was only a limited hashraat Shechina, the limited visibility of HaKadosh Baruch. Ata now with the Mishkan, Kvod Hashem Malay. This is a full awareness, full presence of Hashem. Kvod Hashem Malay me'amilui haro'eh lo be'etzem. That this is the full presence that a human being can get to, the highest it can reach. For us, hayano rama'od, and this is a rather awesome sight. And that's why, again, to go back to the Kliyakos, that has to be covered by the Anan. The Alkain, and therefore, since here at the construction of the Mishkan, we're talking about a very high level of Hashrat Shechina, Lo Yachol Moshe Moshe was not able to enter because the Shechina was at a very high level and it was no Rama'od, very awesome. B'Shema Tomar. Now, if you want to ask, why is this any different than what Moshe had before? Shakarlo Omoed, Gamhu. He also called that Omoed, right? We saw before in Kitisa. The Shamaya Yored Anan Diber Moshe. There the Anan would come down and speak with Moshe. Therefore, the pasuk here has to say, Shechina love Anan, even though the Anan was resting on it. V'hu Sham b'midrasho. In Moshe's tent, it was only there temporarily. And Hashem's presence was not fully visible. Achata here at the Mishkan, Shachan Alav Anan, the Anan is resting on it fully. Why? Kivalish Kon Sham Kol Yemei Heyotam b'Mishkan. Hashem wants to rest His presence there the entire time the Mishkan is there. And also here, it's now an 8 Ratzon. It's now a time that Hashem is very, very close to Am Yisrael. Because Hashem has now forgiven them because of their tshuva for Chet HaEgel. And He gave them the second Luchot. And now, through the construction and assembly of the Mishkan, Hashem is coming lahashrot shtina al kol Yisrael to rest His presence on all of Klal Yisrael. Al kain, therefore, v'kavod Hashem malayat hamishkan. Hashem's presence filled the Mishkan. The Efshar, and perhaps. This is what Chazal that we read in Torah Kohanim before. This is what they were alluding to. One pasuk says Moshe could not enter. Another one says he did enter. The third pasuk says Ki Shachan Olav Anan, that when the Anan was resting on it, the full presence of Hashem was there. He couldn't come in. When the Anan was not there and the presence of Hashem was not there fully, he was able to enter. Shavadayu Kshalahem, because it was definitely challenging for them to understand. She'omro, how could it say of Moshe that Moshe came into the Omoed after saying Lo Yachol Moshe Lava? It would not be only when Hashem calls him. Moshe came in. That Moshe, on his own initiative, would come into the Omoed to speak to Hashem. Seems to be the exact opposite of only coming in when Hashem calls you. Okay, therefore, that when the Kvod Hashem was there fully, and the Anan was on it, then Moshe could not enter. The first time that they finished the construction of the Mishkan and left it standing on this Rosh Chodesh day, this day of the 8th day of the Miluim, that day Hashem's presence was there fully, and Moshe was not allowed to enter until Hashem called him. Okay, let's go. We got a few more minutes. Let's go to Malvin. Okay. Again, quotes the same midrash, the the midrash that we saw in Torah Kohanim. There's Gimel Kadvei Chadam Lo Yachol Moshe Levo Lo Amoed, Kadvei Chadam Levo Moshe Lo Amoed, Pasuk Vichu Nekiach Moshe Chadam. Ever Miata. What does this mean? Kol Zman Shahaya Alav Anan Lo Haya Cholava. When the Anan was resting, it was a sign that Hashem's presence was in the Mishkan. Moshe was not allowed to enter. Nistalik Anan, when it left, Nichnas Medaber Imo, Moshe could go in and enter and speak to Hashem. It seems strange because wait a minute, the Anan doesn't leave, because if we read the next pasuk, it says that the Anan was on the Mishkan throughout the whole stay in the desert for the next 40 years. The other Reish Parak Balot, and it says in Balotcha we have the same concept of Yom HaKimet HaMishkan Kisai Anan Oel, and it stayed there until they were ready to travel. So how can we say that? Wait a minute, when the Anan goes up, that means it's time to travel. When is Moshe coming in to talk? The Anan was always there. Mevu'ar, which seems to imply that when the Anan left, they were busy getting ready to travel. There wasn't time for Moshe to sit and talk to Hashem when they were busy getting ready to travel. So all of this is to imply Rak Yom Hashmini, on that 8th day, this day of the construction of Mishkan, Hayak Kvod Hashem, the presence of Hashem, Ha'esh Hanivra, this Eish that we've talked about at Har Sinai, Mimaleyat HaMishkan Mibifnim, that filled the whole inside of the Mishkan. The Anan Yechasela Mibachutz, and the Anan only covered it outside. Shezeh Siman Li Haglot Shechina Hashchina. This was the sign of the visibility, the presence, the awareness of the Shechina. The Shechina was revealed to Am Yisrael. Shel Pa'amim Hu Haya Kavod Mechuseh Be'anan, U'Lefamim Hu Miguleh. That sometimes when Hashem's presence is revealed, it's covered with this Anan, and sometimes it's not covered with the Anan. Moshe Kazav B'Sol Parshat Mishpatim, as we saw in the end of Mishpatim, Har Sinai. Hashem's presence rested on Har Sinai v'Chasei Anan, and the Anan covered it. But Salomish Anan Kisai HaKavod, that the Anan covered Hashem's Kavod so that it would be accessible to human beings. Sheish Demim for 6 days, Moshe B'Yom Hashmini Tochanan Meikvod Hashem K'Eish Ochelet Rosh Hahar. Ratzalomar, to teach us that at Har Sinai, She'azni Kalek Kavod Mitoche Anan, that Hashem's presence was visible to Am Yisrael through this Anan. Sha'esh Ochelet Hu Kavod Yivra Shenikra Kavod Hashem. This Eish, this fire at Har Sinai, was a tangible, physical sign that Am Yisrael could see of the presence of Hashem, of the glory of Hashem. Obviously, it wasn't this full presence. The Anan Varfel Svivav, in order for Am Yisrael to be able to witness it, it had to be surrounded by Anan and Arafel, this cloud and covering. And sometimes it's covered, then Moshe can enter. But if it's not covered with an Anan or with Arafel, even Moshe can't enter. Therefore, Hashem has to call him to come in to when he puts the Anan there so that he can enter. And that's why the pasuk explains that Moshe, when Hashem calls Moshe, he has to have this Anan so that Moshe can enter. However, wants to finish up by saying the following: when the Kavod Hashem is nitkaleh, when it's open and there's no Anan, then Moshe can't enter unless Hashem calls him. V'chein po nitkaleh hakavod, since it was open, it was not covered by the Anan. L'chein lo yochol likanes, Moshe is not allowed to enter. Masha katuv nistalik Anan, and when the Anan left, lav dafka that the Anan left. Ki Anan ayatamil al Mishkan. The Anan was always there, as we saw later on in Sugin Balotcha. It's a different level of Anan. There's the level of Anan that's just an Anan covering. There's a level of Anan that has to be covered, has to be heavier to cover the Kavod Hashem. Ki hakavod nistalik min hamishkan al tachat kanfei hakruvim yazay yachol lavo. That when the full kavod goes and is mitzamtzem and contracts itself to only cover the area of the Aron cover, tachat shnei hakruvim, then with the Anan, Moshe is allowed to enter. is when Ratzalomar Shayanan Shamalbish and a Kavod, the Tochanan Kazel or Yochalavo, that the Anan was Malbish the Kavod, but the Kavod filled the whole Mishkan, therefore he wasn't able to enter the Mishkan. And similarly, we find the same thing he brings down as we saw before by the Beit HaMikdash. Same thing there. Okay, and I think that's the rest of this basically the same thing. Okay, cool. Okay. 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 And again, so this whole thing that the presence of Hashem personally fills the Mishkan means that nobody can enter. It also, and we find the same thing about Beit HaMikdash, but in general, that throughout Hashem is mitzamtzem that presence to a much smaller area, so that Moshe can enter and the Kohanim can enter, do the Avodah, and Moshe can enter to speak with him. And that is, again, what the different Pesukim are trying to allude to, the different levels of Shechina. And we hope and pray that we should be zocha, that we should be able to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash and perhaps have a better understanding of this than we have today by trying to read through all of this, which really, again, as I say, there's a big challenge because we're physically trying to understand something that is very, very non-tangible, very, very difficult to understand. But as about Hashem, as I say, Mashiach should be coming soon. We should be Shlema, and we should be able to at least get some idea of what all of this means. So thank you all. At this point, I'm going to open it up for questions, comments, or feedback. If you have any questions or comments, and if not, I will wish everyone a good rest of the week and a Shabbat Shalom. And Chazak, Chazek, and we should be back. Bezrat Hashem, next week there will be a shiur, but it will probably not focus on the parshat. We'll probably focus on some aspect of the Haggadah. I haven't yet figured out what, but that's the plan for next week. Have a good rest of the week, a Shabbat Shalom, and Laila Tov to all.